Hey everyone, welcome to JDMD, the show where we talk about everything from injections to objections. I'm Baka-Raptor, a lawyer based in Tokyo, Japan, and with me is Allopathosaurus, a doctor based in the United States. What's going on?
Well, I'll tell you what's not going on. I'm not saving any lives at the moment. So every once in a while I have some free time. So here I am.
All
Do
right,
this.
well, today we got to talk about a current event news topic, the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, and I'm sure that's big news in the US right now, right?
Oh, absolutely. This has been a big media thing for the last few weeks, actually. And actually, I'm a little bit surprised that the verdict didn't carry as much of an impact, or at least that I can see right now, but certainly big news.
All right. Well, I watched most of the trial, if not the whole thing, I'm not quite sure, but I watched most of the trial live online from Japan, and that kept me up really late almost every night for the past 2 weeks. But yeah, I'm going to analyze the trial here. And if you have any questions about that, of course, interrupt me at any time, let me know, and I'll try to answer your questions as a non-legal observer from the standpoint of a legal observer. And the first thing I want to do is just go through the timeline of events for this trial and actually the events leading up to it, because these events in Kenosha, they started with the shooting of Jacob Blake. Now, I'm sure you know about that. That was big news, especially with all the Black Lives Matter riots going on last year. So what do you know about the shooting of Jacob Blake?
So basically, this came about around August of last year, which was just 3 months after the murder of George Floyd.
Mhm.
So this was a time where the Black Lives Matter movement had more momentum than ever before. Tensions were high, a lot of changes were happening, a lot of protests were going on. So just a very, very tense atmosphere. And the Jacob Blake shooting was a spark to all of this. Now, here, you obviously know a lot about this story. I know some about the story. It's been a
I,
little while, but
yeah, I don't really
go
know
on.
the full story surrounding it, but yeah, I've looked into it and I've also watched the video. So it's my understanding that the scene that really set everyone off was an officer shooting this guy, Jacob Blake, several times in the back as he was entering his car. And regardless of any other circumstances surrounding that, that looks awful. You never want to shoot someone in the back. That's just really bad publicity, right? But I would have to agree with the protesters here. I think that was an unjustified shooting. From a legal standpoint, the police have a lot of latitude that I don't really think they deserve, but I couldn't say whether it's legally justified or unjustified, especially not knowing the full scenario. But from what I understand, this guy, Jacob Blake, he sort of trespassed upon his baby mama's property to sort of get his kids back during a time when he wasn't allowed to have them. And the baby mama called the police to have him arrested. Now, Jacob Blake, apparently he's either a really big, strong guy, or the police officers in Kenosha are really puny, weak guys, because they tried several times to restrain him and just bounced off him like Teflon when they tried to tackle him. So he is kind of making his way back towards his car, which the kids are inside at this point, and he's trying to drive away. And I don't know all the details of what's going on here. There's some allegations that he was carrying a knife. There's some allegations that he may not have been carrying a knife at the time, but he was reaching for a knife in his car. And there are other allegations that he wasn't even reaching for the knife, but a knife was found somewhere in his car afterwards. I don't know the full picture here, but in any case, it didn't look to me like he was an immediate danger to the police officer. And the officers just seemed to, after being unable to restrain him in any other way, whether it was tackling him or I don't know if they used pepper spray or tasers or anything like that, but it seemed like all they could do to stop him in any way was to shoot him like 6 or 7 times in the back. And thankfully, Jacob Blake survived. And also, I don't want to, you know, get anyone given the wrong idea here. I think that Jacob Blake was in the commission of a crime and he's not a good person. And from his interview afterwards, I think he gave an interview on some media channel. He seemed like he was kind of full of shit, but at the same time, that shooting, you shouldn't be shooting someone in the back, especially when they don't appear to be a physical threat. So I don't know if that's consistent with what you've read about or seen about it.
All right, for starters, I've decided, I'm so disgusted by news media in so many different areas because you can never find a truly unbiased, objective version of any account, whether it be conservative or liberal. So for better or for worse, I've been getting most of my information from Wikipedia,
Okay.
especially especially for stories like this that have been like now more than a year old, where many of the facts are out. So with that said, according to Wikipedia, um, regarding the issue of the knife, I mean, there's a lot of dispute about it. There's a lot of things that were disputed, like, the fighting, whether he was really belligerent, bystanders who reported the video say, he wasn't being violent, that we didn't see any weapons. Knife was found in the car on the floor on the driver's side. They say Blake later admitted that he, quote, wasn't thinking clearly as he picked up a knife during the altercation, although he denied having the intent to use it.
Okay, that's pretty fishy right there. But yeah.
So, it makes it hard, like, because you can't make it, if you're going to say, like, he's holding it, he wasn't planning on using it, maybe he wasn't thinking clearly, which might have been true. But certainly, he wasn't unarmed. And it sounds like, this was a rather long altercation, I would say. In defense of the officers that were there, it doesn't sound like they got there and they just like shot him up front,
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like they had attempted to de-escalate it on several occasions and then ultimately, shot him at that point. But you're right. With that said, his back was turned to them, and he wasn't like directly as at that second trying to attack them or harm them. So, I mean, I absolutely agree with the media perception. I don't think it portrays the full story, but I do agree that it looks very bad, and I could see why it would lead to the protest that it led to.
Yeah, so I guess if he admitted himself that he had a knife, then it's hard to imagine the police officers facing any sort of punishment for what happened. But still, it looked to me on the video that I saw that he wasn't a danger at that time when the shooting occurred. And it didn't seem like he was really fighting back all that hard. It was just a matter of the officers trying to tackle him and him just kind of shrugging them off more than anything else. I think the whole issue just could have been avoided if the officers worked out or studied some martial arts or something, because yeah, they came off looking really, really weak in that video. But in any case, I guess we can see why this whole issue blew up, because yeah, someone got shot in the back several times during the height of the Black Lives Matter protests last year. So riots erupt in Kenosha, and this started on August 23rd, 2020. Then this guy, Kyle Rittenhouse, who was from Antioch, Illinois, which is really close to the border between Illinois and Wisconsin, he gets called apparently by, and this is still kind of shady also, I'll get into this later, but he's either called by the owner of a car lot or someone who knows the owner of a car lot to sort of bring his gun down and help protect that car lot during the riots. So on August 25th, 2 days after the Jacob Blake shooting, he goes down there with some of his friends and some of his friends of his friends, other people in this little group, and they start guarding this car source, a lot called the Car Source, with like rifles and other medical equipment that he brought with him. I think Kyle testified that he was just going down there to help protect the lot and also provide medical assistance, since he was a lifeguard. He was trained to be an EMT. And, you can see him in some of the videos walking around and offering medical help to various people. And some people telling him to go fuck off because he's carrying a gun, and I guess they don't want him involved in anything. But yeah, when it comes to the whole intention of Kyle for going there, it seems to me pretty clear that he wasn't intending to go down there just because he was looking for the chance to shoot people up. But at the same time, he had a gun ready, and if he had to defend himself, I guess, or defend someone else, he would have been ready to use that gun. But we'll get into that as the story progresses. So you saw him offering medical help at some times, you saw him washing graffiti at some points, and you saw him walking around, not just on the Car Source parking lot, but also throughout the town, offering medical help, just sort of observing the whole riot. And at some points, someone pushes a flaming dumpster into the street. He grabs a fire extinguisher and puts that fire out. So he's out there doing all kinds of things, not just protecting the lot. There are some people who are telling him and other people with him, the don't protect the street, go back and protect your property, because they don't feel like he should be welcome out onto the street where the Black Lives Matter protesters are. Maybe they felt threatened or something like that. Maybe they felt like he wasn't part of the Black Lives Matter crowd. But in any case, there are very clear tensions building up throughout the night. Some people are telling him to fuck off. Some person tells him that he's going to kill him. And that person actually turns out to be Rosenbaum, the first guy who Kyle shoots. But yeah, at some point throughout the night, a gun goes off. And this gunshot isn't from Kyle Rittenhouse, but people are looking around trying to figure out where that gunshot's coming from. And people see Kyle with the gun. He's kind of standing by himself, so he's an easy target, I guess. But people start converging on him, thinking that he's the guy who shot him. You hear a lot of commentary in the background. One guy says cranium him, as if to say, smack him across the head, break his skull apart or something. And Kyle starts to run. Now, at this point, this is where the whole thing really starts to develop into a case of homicide or self-defense. In the case of homicide, Rosenbaum, the guy who threatened him earlier in the night, starts chasing after him. And Rosenbaum, this guy, he throws his bag at him. This is a bag that he got from a hospital. Apparently, he was discharged from a hospital earlier that day, and it just had his belongings, but that was really the only kind of handheld weapon that he had. He threw his bag at him. It hit Kyle. Kyle keeps on running. At some point, Kyle turns around with his gun held and looks toward Rosenbaum, possibly pointing the gun towards Rosenbaum, but he doesn't shoot at that point. Now, Rosenbaum continues chasing towards him. Kyle continues running away. Now, at some point, Kyle gets to a part in a parking lot where there's a wall to one side, there are a few parked cars to the other side, and it's not impossible to get through those cars. In fact, he does walk through those cars later, or kind of jog through those cars later, but he has to slow down because of it. He can't just sprint right through. So Rosenbaum sort of comes in at him. At some point, Kyle turns around and Rosenbaum kind of lunges towards him, sort of as if he's grabbing towards the gun. And at this point, Kyle, he shoots Rosenbaum 4 times in 0.76 seconds. So in about 3/4 of a second, he unleashes 4 shots while Rosenbaum is very close to the gun as he's lunging at him. And then, he starts to run off. More people hear gunshots, and Kyle keeps running. He tries to run towards the police. And at this point, a bunch of people start chasing him. One guy hits him in the back of the head with a skateboard. Kyle keeps trying to run, but eventually he stumbles and falls to the ground. And this is where we get a few more altercations. So there's one guy who sort of jump kicks him, and this guy is referred to by the defense attorneys simply as Jump Kick Man, since he wasn't at the trial. So Jump Kick Man, he jumps up, he kicks Kyle, arguably in the face. Kyle said that he was actually kicking the face. Other people say that he missed, but yeah, Kyle shoots at him, but he doesn't actually hit Jump Kick Man. Then there's another guy, the skateboard guy, who goes back and gets a skateboard and tries to hit Kyle again. He hits Kyle, Kyle shoots at him, and I believe there were 2 shots in this case, and Kyle hit with both shots, and the guy with the skateboard also fell to the ground and died. Then there was one more guy who would end up surviving, but he approached Kyle, drew out a gun. At first, it was kind of unclear. He was kind of holding his hands up, but then sort of aimed towards Kyle. Kyle pulled his gun up towards that guy and shot that guy in the gun arm. That he was holding a pistol in that arm got blown off. So that guy was never actually able to get a shot in at Kyle. At this point, there's some other people standing in the background, but they see the shooting. They don't want to approach Kyle. Perhaps they see that it's dangerous and they want to keep their distance. Kyle gets up, he runs towards the police. Now this part's actually kind of funny because he runs towards the police, sort of to surrender and say that he shot someone, that he wants help. The police actually pepper spray Kyle at this point. I actually didn't know about this until the trial. So they just make things worse. And something that you often hear by various commentators is that, well, if Kyle were black, the police, they wouldn't have helped him. They would have shot him. But then you have an event like this where the police are just pepper spraying this guy while he's trying to surrender to them. And it's like, man, the police are just completely incompetent no matter how you look at it. And arguably it would have been worse if he was black. You can't say that for sure, but the police, they were completely useless that night. And that's a whole nother story. Whether they should have done more, they should have just stayed back, people have different opinions about how interventionist police should be at riots like this. But in any case, Kyle, after getting pepper sprayed by the police, he goes back to the car lot that he was protecting. He speaks a little bit to the people he was originally with. Then he goes home, and eventually he turns himself in to the police, I believe, in Antioch, Illinois. So that seems to be the whole event for that night. He shot at 4 people. 3 of them, well, 2 of them died. One of them just had severe injuries to his arm, and he ended up surviving, and he testified at the trial. And then there was the one guy who jump kicked him in the face, and he did not appear at the trial. He was just referred to as Jump Kick Man. His identity was discovered kind of later, and I'm going to talk about that later if we have time, like whether that guy could have been called to trial or not, because the prosecution was perhaps hiding his identity. We don't really know, but it seems awfully shady. Anyway, so that's basically what I have for the timeline of events. Do you have any questions at this point or any comments at this point?
Well, no, this is basically what I had heard as well, or not so much what I heard, what I read about the case. What I read about the case was significantly different than my initial impression of what happened, and that's something, we'll talk about more when we talk about media coverage. As a quick comment on your one argument that you had made about everyone going on, well, if it was a Black guy, they wouldn't have done anything, or they would have shot him, or he wouldn't be alive today, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which I actually think is a rather weak argument, even if it may have truth to it, because, I agree, if a person of color might have been treated very differently. But with that said, if that's the case, then the problem isn't so much with how they treated Rittenhouse. The problem is with how they would have treated somebody else. So I don't think it would necessarily be applicable in this case.
Absolutely. That makes sense. Absolutely. I completely understand. The issue isn't that we should shoot Kyle Rittenhouse 7 times in the back. The issue is that we should have not shot Jacob Blake 7 times in the back, right?
Correct.
I completely agree on that point. And there really needs to be a lot of police reform in this country. I don't necessarily agree with people who say defund the police or, just sort of reorganize the police. I think a lot of change needs to happen, but it really needs to be thought through. And a lot of these knee-jerk reactions toward the police, they're kind of superficial. I, as kind of a flaming libertarian, have been thinking about what we can do with the police for a very long time. And there really is no easy answer. Just saying something like, well, defund the police, problem solved, right? Well, it's not quite that simple, but I know where that sentiment is coming from, and I have to agree with it to some extent, but you do need the police to get things done. I mean, if the police were more involved, perhaps this situation never would have happened. And there's a lot of sort of political issues behind the police as well. It seems like in many of these sort of Black Lives Matter supporting cities like Portland, for example, the police are really politically directed to be hands off. And that seems to be allowing a lot of this violence to occur. And I think that's a mistake too. So yeah, we'll see what eventually happens, whether there are political consequences for this or whether various governments decide to be more politically neutral or less politically active in deciding who to punish and who not to punish. The whole thing's a real mess, but all right. So from this night, I want to talk about some of the legal charges that were brought against Kyle Rittenhouse. Now, there are the obvious charges of homicide, first-degree reckless homicide against 2 of the people who died, right? There was Rosenbaum, the guy who threw the bag, and then there was the skateboard guy. I think his name was Huber, but, the skateboard guy who hit him twice, I believe. He was shot dead, so those were 2 homicide charges. And there are also what's called lesser included offenses. This is a legal term that basically means offenses that you necessarily commit when you commit a more serious offense. So if you commit first-degree reckless homicide, you can also be charged with second-degree reckless homicide. And because the standard for second-degree reckless homicide is lower, you necessarily commit second-degree homicide when you're committing first-degree homicide. So that might sound a little complicated, but basically, there are various degrees of different crimes. There are lesser crimes, greater crimes, and you can be charged all the way up to the most serious crime, first-degree reckless homicide, or you can be charged with something slightly less based on the same set of facts. So I'm not going to get too much into this because it's not really that relevant, because self-defense is a perfect defense to all of these. But just so you know, those were some of the issues at play here, because at some point during the trial, the prosecution asked to include those lesser charges, and the defense kind of had to consent to it. I'm not an expert on Wisconsin law, right? So I don't know exactly whether consent is necessary to bring these charges, but that was one part of the trial that I think people are curious about. All right, so there are the homicide charges. Then there's another one that I think was really interesting here. It was called reckless endangerment. And this means that you recklessly put someone in a situation where they could be severely harmed. The argument here was that perhaps, when you're directly shooting at someone and hitting someone, that would be homicide, right? But reckless endangerment would be, because you discharge that gun in a crowded public space, you are endangering people who are standing in the background, because the bullet could have hit them if you were being reckless. You could have, it could have gone through someone and then hit someone else, right? So that's reckless endangerment. Basically, it's that you put the general public around you in danger through your reckless actions, such as discharging a gun recklessly. All right. And then let's see what else there was. Let's see, reckless endangerment. What do I have here? Like attempted homicide. That was a charge brought against the guy who he shot in the arm. So obviously he didn't actually kill the person, but you can make the argument that he was trying to by pointing, an AR-15 style rifle at him and pulling the trigger and hitting him. So there's attempt over there. There was, let's see, possession of a weapon, possession of a dangerous weapon by a person under 18. This was a very controversial topic online, because so many people were so sure that Kyle Rittenhouse was not legally permitted to carry this weapon. And yet the charge was thrown out before the end of trial. So clearly something's wrong here, right? We were actually talking about this before, and I predicted that the charge would get thrown out. And you were kind of surprised by that, but it was thrown out, right? So clearly lots of people are not on the same page here, and they're not apparently even reading the same law, or they have very different ideas of the same law that they're reading. And the last thing that Kyle was charged with, was a sort of curfew violation, which is another one that was thrown out. I mean, he was found not guilty on everything, but the procedure behind how he was thrown out on the curfew violation was another really weird one. So yeah, let's talk about those after getting through the trial itself. But at this point, those are the charges. Any questions, any comments?
No comments on that. That was a pretty good summation of everything. Yeah, I think all of those were pretty much my understanding of what had gone on. And you're right, it was those last two that I was relatively certain he would be charged with or convicted of. But yeah, I think all the rest of them, based on my understanding of the situation, I could pretty much tell that, those weren't going to go anywhere.
All right. Well, in that case, let's get into how these issues were resolved, either at trial or before trial, or whatever point in the trial they happen to be resolved at. So let's first take a look at the gun possession charge, because I think that's one that so many people are curious about. Now, there's the whole crossing state lines issue that so many people seem to bring up online. He carried a gun and he brought it across state lines. So therefore, because he's 17, he is guilty. I'm sure you read plenty of stuff about that, right?
Mm-hmm. It was mentioned multiple times, both online and in news channels.
Well, I can tell you, for me, that was really annoying, because that seemed to have nothing to do with anything. When crossing state lines comes up in a general legal context, that comes up when you're thinking about bringing federal charges against someone or bringing something into federal jurisdiction. As a general matter, when something occurs strictly within the borders of one state, it is a state issue, and the federal government isn't going to involve itself in that, or they don't even have the power to involve themselves in that. Now, of course, there are some exceptions. If it's a federal law that's being violated, yeah, you can bring that in federal court. You can have federal charges, of course. If it's on a sort of federally protected land within that state, if it happens against a federal, if it involves a federal employee in the state, then yeah, sometimes you can bring it in federal court and have federal charges. But generally, when you have interstate action here, crossing state lines during the commission of an offense, or even with the intent to commit an offense, then you can bring in federal jurisdiction for various charges. And you see that in many other cases, but those kinds of charges and that kind of jurisdiction, as far as I'm aware, was never asserted in this case. So it was completely irrelevant. And let me give you an example here when crossing state lines might matter. Sometimes you read about, child trafficking cases. And if you travel from one state to another with the intent to traffic a child, or you actually physically carry that child across state borders, then that can become a federal trafficking issue. And that makes sense, right? But if you're kidnapping a child just in one state, then perhaps the federal government would not have jurisdiction. It would just be a trial or charges according to the laws of that state that you're in. So that's how this kind of thing plays out sometimes. But here, as far as I'm aware, there were only ever state charges here. And the idea of crossing state lines really means absolutely nothing. So everyone still harping online about this is completely full of shit as far as I'm concerned.
Is there any reason why they didn't file federal charges?
I don't know. And there are some rumors that the Department of Justice might go after him. I honestly don't know or don't even expect that to happen, but it's possible. Like, I haven't analyzed this entire issue. I've just looked at the issues that actually were charged. So it's entirely possible that the federal government could in some way, shape, or form inject themselves into this case. But I think people are, at this point, the sense that I get is that people are content to let this case sort of flame out at this point, because everything just seems so obviously in Kyle Rittenhouse's favor here. In other cases, for example, the George Floyd case up in, where was that? Where was that?
Minnesota.
In Minnesota. Yeah, the Derek Chauvin trial. That was one where if Derek Chauvin had not been convicted, it looked very likely that the federal government was going to bring some kind of civil rights charge against Derek Chauvin. And that appears to be one of the reasons why Derek Chauvin has not appealed, or at least is not planning to appeal. It's because, kind of as a condition for not appealing, the federal government is not going to bring any further civil rights charges. That's what I've heard, and I don't know if there's any truth to this, but yeah, that kind of thing is always a possibility, but I have not seen any, serious reason to believe that it's going to happen in this case.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
So the gun statute here, even the facts of this case, people are just getting flat out wrong. Kyle did not have this gun in his possession in Illinois. He didn't cross state lines with the gun. From my understanding, based on the testimony in this case, Kyle's friend, who was 18, bought the gun for Kyle. Kyle gave him money, and the friend bought the gun. And it was sort of an understanding between the two that Kyle would use the gun whenever they went out together, but otherwise possession of the gun would stay with the friend at the friend's father's house or something like that. And I don't know if that's legal. That may be considered a straw purchase or something like that. I don't really know. But that issue, once again, was never actually charged in this case. So Kyle, he only ever possessed the gun in Wisconsin, and he didn't buy the gun himself. He seems to have some idea of what the law was beforehand, because he seemed to know that at his age, it definitely would be illegal for him to possess a pistol, like a shorter gun. But he seemed to have some idea that an AR-15 style weapon or a longer rifle, and I don't know anything about guns, so please don't kill me in the comments here for mixing up your guns and your clips and your magazines and all that, but it seems like he had some idea of which guns were legal, or at least which guns he thought were legal to carry and which ones weren't, and whether possession was legal, whether purchase was legal, whether storage was legal, whether crossing state lines was legal. He had some background here. All right, so he crosses over into Wisconsin, where the gun is kind of ready for him, courtesy of his friend or his friend's father, and he possesses the gun, at the car source lot, where he starts walking around. So that's the possession of the gun. He definitely possesses the gun, make no mistake about that. This is incontrovertible in the video. He actually had a sling across his chest with the gun attached to it. So no question that he was actually possessing the gun. Now, as to whether he was allowed to possess it under the Wisconsin statutes, under the Wisconsin law, my reading of the statute was that Yes, he was able to. And it seemed pretty clear to me, or at least I think anyone with legal training should have been able to read through the statute line by line and conclude that, yes, if you are 17 years old in the state of Wisconsin and you have a long enough gun or a gun with a long enough barrel, then it is actually legal for you to carry that gun or possess that gun if you are under 17. And that would not apply to shorter guns like handguns, but that's not an issue here. And the prosecution was trying to argue that he needed to have a hunting license in order for this to be allowed, because there is a separate part of that statute. And by statute, I just mean written law that was passed by, the legislature and approved by the executive branch. That's all it means. So statute is just written law. According to that statute, Kyle was, allowed to possess the gun at 17, even if he did not have a hunting permit. And once again, I think that was pretty clear based on my reading of the statute. But the prosecution, they tried to muddy the issue a lot. And eventually, in the middle of the trial, the judge took one more look at the statute, read through it piece by piece, and said, you know what? We brought up the issue of the length of the gun at trial. They never actually measured it, which was almost a killer mistake for the defense. But, just I don't want to get into legal mumbo jumbo here, but this was not an affirmative defense. They didn't actually have to prove the specific length of the gun. It was the prosecution that had to prove the length of the gun. And they failed to do that. It was asserted at trial by one of the witnesses that the length of the gun was, an allowable length for someone who is under 18 to be able to possess. And so that charge was thrown out. Long story short, the gun was long enough, and someone 17 years old was allowed to carry that type of gun, even if he didn't have a permit. And that was explicitly written in the statute. So I think that was a very clear issue, actually. And the judge was right to dismiss that before it was sent to the jury. Does that make sense?
Perfect. Yeah, no, that definitely clarifies a lot of that.
Yeah, and I could go into more procedural detail here or more into the reading of the statute here, but yeah, a lot of people were trying to pretend that this was a much more complicated or murky statute than it actually was. I think that if you just take your time and read through it line by line, it's pretty clear that he was allowed to carry this type of gun. And people talk about the intention of the statute. Why would they even have this kind of exception in the first place? Why can a 17-year-old carry a gigantic AR-15 style rifle, but not a tiny little handgun? Well, it appears that the intention behind writing it this way was to curb inner city violence, where people are kind of shooting at other people with these smaller handguns, but at the same time, allow people living in rural areas, like on farms, to be able to protect themselves against, like, animals or go hunting or things like that, because they're not so concerned about rural use of guns, but they wanted to sort of curb inner city use of smaller guns. And that's why they wrote it in this manner.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. It's something that I didn't consider, and I don't think many people did.
Yeah, so some people would say, well, if that was the intent, then why not require a hunting license for that if you're under 18? And that's a reasonable point. Maybe the legislature should write the statute like that, but that's a coulda, woulda, shoulda kind of issue. It's not how the statute was actually written. So the way it was actually written, Kyle was perfectly legal in his possession of that rifle. End of story. All right. So next issue I want to get to, another issue that was thrown out before the issue went to the jury, was the curfew violation.
Yes.
And this seemed to me like the one issue that would be a real slam dunk for the prosecution, because how more clear could you get? The curfew violation, the curfew alleges that, I guess, after 8 p.m., you're not allowed to be out on the street. And of course, many people were in violation of this, but you see this, like, I used to work in a traffic court, so I heard this excuse all the time. Everyone else was speeding, so why can't I speed too? Why do they pick on me instead of taking care of everyone who's violating the same law? And that's no legal excuse, right? Just because everyone else is jumping off a bridge doesn't mean you should too. And here, it seemed pretty clear. Kyle was out on the street after 8 p.m., after the curfew. Now, I don't know the full procedural story behind this, but it appears that this charge was thrown out because the prosecution did not establish that this was a lawful curfew. As a general matter, and I've never dealt with a curfew issue before, it's not like this is a common legal issue across the United States. Only in the case of riots or really weird things like this does a curfew get enacted. Maybe in terms of like COVID, for example, there might have been curfews in some parts of the country. But I've been in Japan the whole time, but didn't have anything like this here. Curfews. I don't know under what sort of legal authority you pass a curfew, or whether it has to be approved by the legislature, whether you have constitutional authority. There are a lot of various issues that can come up. And as a general matter, the prosecution does not have to prove that a law exists. But for this kind of curfew, I guess the judge wanted them to establish that because it was kind of an immediate thing and because it was perhaps enacted under emergency powers. There was one witness who testified that a curfew existed, but that guy was just a random detective. And I guess the judge said that he wanted like more official proof that this curfew was in fact valid. So I don't really know exactly what the full procedural story is here. This could just be an intricacy of Wisconsin law, but the prosecution seemed to fumble the ball here. They never properly established that this curfew was legally valid and in effect. So that charge was thrown out. And I wish I had a better explanation for that, but that's based on what I saw, what happened with the curfew.
Okay, no, that makes much more sense now. It sounds like with any criminal trial, the burden of proof relies on the prosecution, and anytime somebody's acquitted, it's not necessarily because of good defense. I feel like it's more likely that the prosecution failed to make a compelling argument for their case. And I think this is one of those situations where, he certainly was out on the streets beyond a certain hour, but for whatever reason, they just didn't have like enough burden of evidence to show that. So, or that the curfew was valid or very legally recognized.
Yeah, so this one, I'd say it's squarely the prosecution's error here. Now, I was a prosecutor for a year in a traffic court. It's as small time as you can possibly get being a prosecutor, but I do have some experience for that. And there are various minor things that the prosecutor has to establish at trial. And if they fail to do that, even if it seems just like a complete technicality, the case can be dismissed. For example, there are three things that I always had to establish at trial. So I'm not going to say where we're originally from, but Chicago is what? Cook County, Illinois?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's say I'm a prosecutor in Cook County, Illinois. One of the things that I absolutely have to mention at trial during, what's known as my case in chief, when I get up there and have to establish the case as the prosecutor, I have to say that Cook County, Illinois has jurisdiction over this case. So if it's a traffic trial, I have to say that this person was observed speeding at the junction of, what's a famous street? I'm blanking on at the moment, like Lakeshore Drive. And this took place in Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, which is in Cook County, Illinois. If I don't specifically say that this took place at a location in Cook County, Illinois, the case can be dismissed, even if I have everything else. So that kind of stuff happens sometimes. If you forget to establish the jurisdiction explicitly as being Cook County, Illinois in the case of a county trial, or the state of Illinois in the case of a state trial, that jurisdiction must be established. Similarly, the other two things that I was required to prove was identification of the defendant. So at some point in a criminal trial, you're going to have a statement, something along the lines of this. Do you see who was holding the gun at that point in the night? Okay, is he in the courtroom today? Can you point to that person? And the prosecution will have the witness who is on stand point to the defendant and say, okay, let the record reflect that the witness on the stand is pointing to a man wearing a suit with a blue tie, that man being previously identified by the court as the defendant, Kyle Rittenhouse. So it's not enough to just say the person's name, because anyone can recognize the name from beforehand. You actually have to kind of point directly to them in the courtroom. So that's another thing, that if you don't specifically do that in the courtroom, The case gets thrown out. And of course, the usual things that you have to establish each and every element of the crime. And that's to be expected, I suppose. You miss one element, even if it's a seemingly small one, it gets thrown out. So here, like I said before, I don't actually have to establish that a speeding law exists in Cook County, Illinois. Like, I never actually had to do that. But for this curfew, it seemed like for whatever procedural reason, the prosecution had to establish that there was a legally valid curfew at the time, and they simply, for whatever reason, failed to do that, and they got properly called out by the defense on it. So props to the defense for recognizing that that burden was not met by the prosecution. All right. So now let's get to the meat of the trial. Reckless endangerment, homicide, attempted homicide. So going through the trial here, there were some pre-trial motions. And when I say pre-trial motions, of course, if you have any questions about legal procedure here, please let me know, and I'll try to explain it in greater detail. But sometimes there are issues that you want to resolve before trial, because if you do it at trial, there can sort of be the element of surprise, and the other side might not have the opportunity to prepare, even though they're legally entitled to have some, time to prepare on certain issues. It's kind of annoying if you have a jury trial, because there are a lot of issues that are not supposed to be argued before the jury. One of the most important things, almost the purpose of a jury trial, is to limit what evidence the jury gets to see. You can think of that as the purpose of a jury trial. There are some issues that get to be presented before a jury. There's some things that are inappropriate to show to a jury. So if you're arguing about whether something should be shown to a jury or not, then the jury has to leave the room. You argue in front of the judge. You bring the jury back in. You talk about it in front of the jury if you can, and if not, you have to ignore it. If you accidentally say something you're not supposed to, there's an objection. Jury has to leave the room again. You have to argue more in front of the judge. The judge might yell at one of the attorneys, as they did in this trial. You bring the jury back in. The whole thing is a mess. So there's some things that are just much easier to take care of before trial. Figure out what issues you are going to talk about, what issues you're not going to talk about, what witnesses you're going to call, what you're not going to call, what testimony is allowed, what testimony is not allowed. You want to try to clear up as much as possible before trial on issues that both parties can agree on, or even argue some of them before the judge, before the trial, so that you don't have to argue them in front of the jury on trial day, and sort of reduce your workload so you can focus on the things that really do matter when you're actually having the trial. All right. So one of the things that came up a lot, that seemed on social media at least, and by the way, that's how I'm getting most of my news here in Japan, is from social media, just seeing everyone's reactions on Twitter, Facebook, things like that. Because I don't actually watch the news here, there's really no convenient way to do that. I kind of search the news sometimes, Google News, Yahoo News, things like that. But generally speaking, whatever news I'm linked to from social media is what I read, and I don't really trust anyone. I try to verify or triple verify all the news that comes across my feed before deciding what to believe and what not to believe. But yeah, just from the fact that I use social media means I get linked to these articles all the time. And so that's usually my first step in trying to figure out what's going on. So one issue that I saw coming up a lot in the days leading up to the trial was that the judge allowed the defense to refer to the various people who were shot as rioters or arsonists, but the judge did not allow the people who were shot to be referred to as victims by the prosecution. And that seemed like kind of a double standard to a lot of people. If, the first guy who was shot, Rosenbaum, the guy who threw the bag at Kyle, for example, when he was shot, you can't refer to him as a victim. That was something that the judge decided before the trial, but you can refer to him as a rioter or an arsonist. So I think many judges would allow you to refer to them as either one, because it's kind of understood at trial that that's just your claim. It's not necessarily true or not. But the judge here, he was kind of defendant friendly on this issue. He decided that victim is kind of a legal determination, and until he's actually proven of murder, and murder is the legal charge. Murder means that you are guilty of a crime. Simply killing is more of an objective factual issue. You shoot someone, that person dies, that is a killing. But if you shoot someone, that person dies, and then you are convicted of murder, which requires a certain kind of intent and a certain kind of action, that is a legal determination. And unless that person is convicted of murder, then you don't legally have someone you can refer to as a victim. So that might sound a little complicated, and it might sound a little hypocritical. Some judges would allow that, some judges wouldn't. But overall, I don't think it's that big of an issue. And in fact, during the trial, both sides, the defense attorney and the prosecution attorneys, they both referred to these people as victims at different points, and no one seemed to care. But I don't know. Do you have any opinion on that?
I mean, the way I think about it, the way you've explained it, I mean, they don't refer to them as victims, but they're also not referring to them as attackers either. They don't refer to them as aggressors, people who are, assaulting Kyle Rittenhouse. So, you're right. They're not being portrayed sympathetically, but they're also not being portrayed as like, they're not being demonized by the other side either. I do think, given the context and seeing the specific charges of what he's accused of, what isn't, I do think rioter is a reasonable objective middle ground here based on all of this.
And that's basically the conclusion the judge came to. I think what the judge ultimately said wasn't that you can just always refer to them as rioters, but if evidence comes up during the trial that shows that these people are rioters, then in your concluding statements, you can refer to them as rioters or arsonists based on that evidence. But if you say victim, that creates sort of an unfair prejudice against the defendant because he hasn't been convicted of murder yet. So you can't really say that these people are victims. Once again, I think that's a little overly defendant friendly. I see where the judge is coming from, and my own bias actually is towards being defendant friendly. You know how the saying goes, I would rather let 1,000 guilty men go free than chase after them. Or I guess this is the phrase, I don't know how it originally was outside of The Simpsons, but basically you would rather let guilty men go free than throw innocent people in jail, right? That's my own bias here. And I think it's important that we all recognize our own biases when we analyze issues like this. But yeah, I think that it would have been perfectly okay to call these people victims, and it's up to the jury to decide whether they're really people to be sympathized with or not. I think that would have been fine. Like I said, some judges would have allowed it and some judges wouldn't, but in the end, at the end of the day, both sides referred to these people as victims, so it didn't really make a difference.
Out of curiosity, did anybody refer to Kyle Rittenhouse as a victim of assault? I think that would have called it a jury.
I don't recall if the word victim was specifically used. Obviously, that was a large part of the defense, that he was the one being attacked, right? But I don't recall the word victim being specifically used like that. Like, Kyle is the real victim here. I don't recall any arguments along those lines, and I don't think that would have played well because you don't want to show like a lack of sympathy or empathy for the deceased people's families here, right? You don't want to seem like too much of a jerk, and that's part of your trial strategy. Sometimes you want to be real forceful, real self-righteous in the way you're speaking. But I think a more modern style of lawyering is to be more subtle and to show more empathy at trial, to not really attack people so much, but sort of use the scalpel, not the sledgehammer, as some would say, to really be crafty about the way you use your words instead of just being really forceful about the way you speak as a lawyer. So, and there are benefits to both ways, but I think in modern times, people like to be more subtle with their lawyering rather than to be really forceful with their words, to mean like, this guy is the real victim, and this is America, man, you're allowed to carry, people don't do that so much in trials. All right, so anyway, so that was one issue. Another controversy that arose with this judge that I think you noticed at some point, Asian food. So the judge, at some point before one of the lunch breaks on one of the trial days, said that, I hope the Asian food gets here on time, because they ordered some sort of Asian food, whether it was Chinese or Korean or Japanese, I have no idea. But lunch break strategy is actually a pretty serious issue in trials. You don't want to ruin your flow by continuing a witness examination that has to be broken up by a lunch break, or you don't want people making certain decisions right before lunch or right after lunch. There's actually a lot of strategy in this, but at some point, they ask for a lunch break and the judge makes some sort of like random remark like, I hope the Asian food gets here on time, and I hope it's not stuck on one of those boats outside the harbor. And a lot of people, what did you see on social media about this? Because a lot of people were saying, oh, the judge is racist against Asians.
Effectively, that's what the conclusion was, that this judge was some sort of backwards, redneck, for lack of a better word, and that this guy was, because of that, clearly a sympathizer of white supremacy causes, much like the alt-right, like groups that Kyle Rittenhouse associated himself with, and that there was going to be a clear bias in favor of him because of it.
Yeah, and obviously that's complete bullshit, but some people do believe these things. It was clearly a joke about, I don't know exactly where it is, but sometimes on the news you see all these supply boats that are stuck outside harbors that can't really unload their ships. And it was some random weird joke about that. But you could replace Asian food with like pizza and it would be the exact same joke. And that I think is a good standard for determining whether something is racist or not, whether the meaning changes based on whether you change the race involved or not. So yeah, that whole thing was kind of stupid. I think overall the judge was a very good judge. He was clearly very knowledgeable about the law. Certainly much more than myself. I want to make that very clear here. This was a very experienced judge, and it's weird for someone like me who's, well, I mean, technically I've been a lawyer for about 10 years, but I've only spent 1 year practicing in a criminal type system. So I have very little experience with this sort of thing. So for me to criticize a judge is kind of weird, but the one thing I can do is sort of point out where the judge's biases are. And I'm sure the judge also has some self-awareness about these things. But in general, I would say the judge was defendant friendly for the most part. I think in part it's because the judge thought that Kyle Rittenhouse was innocent. I think that was part of it, all right? Because he saw the evidence. He was like, yeah, this is a really, really weak case, but, he's got to preside over it the best he can. So perhaps his own belief that the evidence was really weak by the prosecution led into some of his favorable judgments towards Kyle, all right? But also I think he made very fair judgments based on the evidence, based on his understanding of evidentiary law. And yeah, a lot of the reasons also why he had so many rulings against the prosecution and for the defense was that it was the prosecution that was trying to pull a lot of really shady tactics throughout the trial, and the defense wasn't really trying to pull anything. In fact, that kind of was poor strategy by the defense, in my opinion. The defense could have pushed it a little harder. They could have objected more. They could have made arguments that they refused to make or chose not to make for strategic reasons. They didn't do anything. Well, I'm not going to say they didn't do anything, because there were some times when they made objections that were overruled. But for the most part, the defense really played it safe when it came to doing anything that would be legally controversial in front of the judge. Whereas the prosecution, they kind of knew they had a weak case. It really seemed like that. And so they had to really push what they could get away with in front of the judge. And I'm going to get into that later, talking about various potential ethics violations that the prosecution committed here. But yeah, the prosecution was really pushing it a lot harder than the defense. And that's why so many of the rulings came against the prosecution rather than defense. So maybe some people who don't understand that would think that's a reason why the judge may have come across as being really pro-defense here and anti-prosecution. Okay. So, we've established that I think the judge overall, he was a kind of a funny guy in some ways. He was asking the jury random Jeopardy questions while they were waiting. He made random quips here or there. He was one of those, back in my day when I first started practicing, I talked to President Hoover about his opinion on the, he had random stories like that throughout the trial, and it was kind of funny, but I think he was a very competent judge, and Kyle should be extremely thankful that he got a judge like that.
Sure.
Okay. Now, the prosecution. So in a criminal trial, the prosecution goes first because they have the burden of proof. They have to establish beyond a reasonable doubt that the defense committed a crime. And, like I was saying before, if they fail even one element of that, the defense doesn't even have to do anything. They can say, Judge, Your Honor, the prosecution failed to establish that my client was in the county, in the city of Kenosha. Even though they said everything else, they forgot that one little point. Case dismissed, right? So the defense doesn't even know what they have to defend against until the prosecution actually presents their case. And that's why the prosecution has to go first. So the prosecution goes up first. Generally, the prosecution in any criminal case is at some point going to be putting a law enforcement officer on the stand. They had several of those. And I think overall, the law enforcement officers, they either gave, a lot of credence to the defense, or they gave a lot of credence to the prosecution. And I think overall, the law enforcement officers, they either gave, a lot of credence to the defense, or they gave a lot of credence to the prosecution. And I think overall, the law enforcement officers, they either gave, pro-prosecution testimony or fairly neutral testimony, things that were not necessarily helpful to either side, but things that had to be said to properly establish the case. And that much was fine. But I'd say pretty much every witness that the prosecution put on the stand who was not a law enforcement officer completely blew up in the prosecution's face. And it's a shame that you haven't seen more clips of these witnesses, because if you saw them, you would understand why the jury concluded that Kyle was not guilty. I think everyone who is just really critical of this verdict really has not watched any significant amount of this trial. Because if you watch the witnesses on the stand, you're like, oh my God, how is this even a prosecution's witness? This person, everything that comes out of this person's mouth is supporting the defense. And the prosecution's just digging a hole here. But let me give you an example, because there are two witnesses in particular that I want to talk about. The first one was sort of a citizen journalist. His name was McGinnis. And this is a guy who's kind of like, I guess, a freelance journalist or a YouTuber. He's a guy who goes around with his own camera or his own cell phone and just records everything that he sees around him. I believe he said that he'd been to some of the protests in Portland and other parts of the country where there were Black Lives Matter protests. He wasn't a local. And he came in, he interviewed many people on the street that day. He had his camera out. He actually interacted with Kyle a little bit before the shooting. And so he was a really good sort of eyewitness to the whole thing. The really big weakness of the law enforcement witnesses is that none of them were really eyewitnesses to the events there. A lot of them were basing their testimony on the aftermath or on videos that they saw, which they really shouldn't have been doing, but the defense didn't object. And that's a whole other story. But long story short, Gavin McGinnis and some of these other guys, they were actually there with cameras, eyewitnesses to the whole thing. And yeah, one of the key moments, I think, at this trial, when I really got the sense that things were going to fall in favor of the defense, was when the prosecutor tried to put words in McGinnis's mouth here, this journalist's mouth. You know, you're not supposed to do that as a prosecutor. So when you call your own witness, you're just supposed to ask them basically non-leading questions, which means basically open-ended questions. You're not supposed to be like, well, you saw Kyle pull out a gun and shoot at Rosenbaum 4 times, right? You're not supposed to fill in that many details for the witness that you called yourself. You're supposed to say, what did you see Kyle do? And let the witness be the one who testifies as to all the details. On cross-examination, when you are interviewing or examining the other side's witnesses, that's when you're allowed to use leading questions. So that at that point, you are allowed to and actually encouraged to sort of put words in the witness's mouth. You didn't see Kyle pull out a weapon, did you? You didn't see Kyle shoot first, did you? That's for cross-examination, when you're examining the other side's witness. But when you're examining your own side's witnesses, you're really not supposed to put words in their mouth. And in fact, the other side can object to that. The defense really didn't do that here. But at one point, the prosecution was trying to put words in McGinnis's mouth saying, well, you saw that Rosenbaum was sort of lunging towards Kyle, but he didn't actually say anything, did he? It's like, no. And well, didn't he? I don't recall exactly. And he's like, so you don't actually know what he was thinking, do you? And at this point, if he was really a favorable witness to the prosecution, he would have just said, nah, I don't know what he was thinking. But at this point, McGinnis said, well, he did say, fuck you, and tried to grab the gun. And I'm like, oh shit, the prosecution's own witness just said that he said something kind of threatening and tried to grab the gun. Here's a case of self-defense right here. This moment right here could very well be the trial. So he was, I think, a very fair, a very neutral witness, and that's good for justice, right? A guy who doesn't just do whatever the side that calls him wants him to say. He says, you know, whatever he thinks happened as honestly as he can, and that's good. But that also means that the prosecution probably should have asked better questions or prepped him more. So the prosecution did fail a little bit here, but based at least on this one witness who saw the shooting of Rosenbaum and testified, well, he said, fuck you, and tried to grab the gun. That is a very strong case for self-defense right there. And that was, I think, a very key moment in this trial. Other things this guy said, like he didn't let the prosecution push him around or lead him into the answers that he didn't want to give. And he didn't do that to the defense either. When the defense cross-examined him, he just seemed to be a very neutral, sort of justice-oriented witness. And yeah, I think that was, I think, the second witness called in the whole trial, and that could have been what ended the trial right there, honestly. I think the trial went on actually much longer than it needed to. Both sides seem to have the strategy that you want to get in as much evidence as you can and just see what sticks. But yeah, that was a key moment right there. All right. Another guy that the prosecution called that really blew up in their face was the guy who got shot in the arm, that guy, McGinnis. So that guy, he tried to present himself as another EMT sort of figure, a really nice guy, someone who had medical training and was just there to help out. But on cross-examination, he imploded. The defense caught him saying a lot of things that were
just
really...
to clarify, I think you're talking about Gage Grosskreutz.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So I was just talking about McGinnis, the journalist. Gage Grosskreutz was, I'm sorry, yeah. He was the guy who was shot in the arm, Gage Grosskreutz, yeah. So this guy, he imploded on cross-examination. And that's something I also recommend that you watch. His cross-examination was killer. So he was asked specifically at one point, I mean, one big issue that came up at trial was that he was suing the city of Kenosha for $10 million, and that might bias his testimony. And another issue that came up, actually, so he was asked specifically on cross-examination, Kyle didn't shoot at you until you took the gun in your hand and pointed it at him. Is that correct? And Gage Grosskreutz said, yes. Self-defense right there. Kyle didn't shoot until this guy standing maybe 3 or 4 feet away took out his gun and pointed it at him. And he admitted it himself. Self-defense. It seems like a very clear case. When that witness says that himself, coming out of his own mouth, how can you watch that and then go on social media and say, well, Kyle, it's all his fault. He was just out there because he wanted to pretend that life was like Call of Duty or something like that. It's so stupid. If you actually watch this trial, you know exactly just how easily this case fell into the hands of the defense. So that was a key moment right there as well. And then Gage Grosskreutz, apparently, and I didn't see this, but he goes on Good Morning America the next day, and he just shamelessly continues to act like he's the victim and that pretend that none of the admissions that he made at trial the previous day even happened. And the journalist, or I don't know what kind of show Good Morning America is, whether it's like a talk show or something, whatever, the host of that show, they were giving him such softball questions, apparently. I didn't watch it, but I read some of the transcripts. I heard other people talking about it. They were just letting him say whatever bullshit he wanted, not even questioning about the admissions that he made the previous day under oath on the stand. This is how fucked up the media is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, yeah.
There's a lot that I could say about media biases here in this situation, and just to suffice it, it'd be horrendous. Was there anything else you want to get into, though, with the defense first?
Yeah, I could talk about the defense. Those were 2 witnesses I want to talk about with the prosecution. And yeah, I just want to talk about the media a little bit more. Some of the headlines that I saw after Gage Grosskowitz's extremely damning like cross-examination, where he just, like I said, completely imploded, gave the case away at that point, there was still some very favorable headlines on various news sources about Gage Grosskowitz, saying Gage Grosskowitz testified that he was terrified when he was shot. I'm like, did this person even watch the testimony, or did this person even take away anything worth note? Like, why would they say something like that when this guy clearly just buried his own case? Yeah, it's just pathetic. Yeah,
I will say this based on being here and actually seeing like reactions and everything else like that. And again, part of the reason I didn't want much of the news or anything like that is because I really didn't want to be colored too much with it. I cannot think in recent memory of a worse example of a lynch mob in this situation. Essentially, considering that this happened as a aftermath of a police shooting of a black man who, was not technically unarmed, but I mean, considering that this was just a few months after George Floyd and everything else that went along with it, I mean, there was clear passion about this. And along with that, there was clear, disdain and even hatred for anybody who supported Trump, for that matter, but also people of the alt-right, people associated with Proud Boys or that Boogaloo movement, which Kyle Rittenhouse had clearly aligned with, Blue Lives Matter and things like that. And it became an issue of, putting this guy's beliefs and personal opinions on trial rather than actually putting his actions on. People forget that he is on trial for murder, not for, supporting the police, or even being racist wasn't an issue that he was supposed to be on trial for, if that was even the case. But he was certainly portrayed that way in the media, and therefore a clear assumption that he was guilty prior to being innocent. I will say my own perception of this trial initially, from what I had heard about it, was, okay, this guy, clearly was a bad kid who was just going out there looking to make trouble. And that's really what I thought before I actually sat down and read on Wikipedia, go figure, what actually happened during this event and how it unfolded. And when I clearly saw that he didn't shoot at anybody unless he was clearly being threatened or directly attacked, and that was really the issue. And that was the moment that I realized, okay, this kid isn't guilty and he's going to be, acquitted, or he should be acquitted. But, the media has been slamming him. Everybody talks about this as if it was a race issue. They don't even take into consideration that all three people who were shot at were white people. This wasn't him attacking black people, or certainly not unarmed black people or anybody of color. That was conveniently left out. That's something that I don't think many people knew. Probably a lot of them still don't know, based on what was being seen. It was a clear underreporting. Many people didn't realize that he was being attacked first, that guns were pointed out, that he wasn't the first person to fire shots here. Would it be okay here? I have a post here that I'm pulling up from, a friend with somewhat more conservative leanings. And mind you, this is a post that's being shared around Facebook. I don't know, I didn't fact check any of this, granted, but would you be opposed to me reading a few of these things here?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay. So one thing they say, and you mentioned a few of these things as well. I didn't know that Kyle put out a dumpster fire that was set to blow up. I didn't know that the police were told to stand down as businesses were being destroyed. I did not know that Kyle's dad, grandmother, and friends all lived in Kenosha. Apparently his parents had split up, and actually he has roots there, so he had a reason to be there. Let's see, I don't know that Joseph Rosenbaum knocked him down twice and attempted to kick him. I didn't know that he was hit with a skateboard. More things you mentioned. They mention some of the criminal backgrounds of the people who were shot, which shouldn't be relevant here. But if you're going to bring Kyle Rittenhouse's background and opinions into the mix, then you should bring everyone else's in as well. All or nothing, I see. I didn't know that he did not cross state lines with a gun. Yeah, all things that we're saying that if the media did their job and they reported on those, I shouldn't say, the quote victims in the same way that they reported on Rittenhouse, and they would have painted a much more objective picture here. But they clearly were out to demonize this guy, portray this as an act of racial violence and intolerance and whatnot. When the verdict came out and I looked through social media posts and everything else like that, I actually didn't see as many posts as I thought, but there was only a few posts that I actually saw and read from friends of mine. But one person said something like, well, bigotry and racism wins again. of course, reducing like actual evidence to quote racism. Another friend who posted something like, well, so if I'm perceived as a threat, somebody's allowed to just shoot me as I'm walking down the street? To which my response would be like, well, I think most people would perceive you as a threat if you stood there and pointed a gun at them or hit them with a skateboard. I mean, I think most people, that would be a reasonable thing to do, is to shoot at that person and defend yourself, but no,
Uh,
most people say,
Actually, you know what? One thing I'd like to ask you as a doctor, deadly force. All right. A lot of people, they just see movies. They think that if you take a punch in the face or get smacked with a skateboard, yeah, you'll just get up a few seconds later when everything's, all fine. But let me just ask you, your medical opinion, can getting hit in the head with a skateboard kill you?
oh, absolutely. You know, it depends on, I mean, you're taking a rather hard object. I mean, this is sort of the equivalent of generating enough force. You could argue that being hit in the head with a hammer would do the same thing. I mean, this isn't like some light object. You're not hitting them with a feather. Or like hitting them with a rock would have the same effect, which, you know, people, depending on how much force you use, it may not kill you, but it certainly has the potential to. You could develop bleeds in your head that may not present until days later, and you may not initially recognize. It's not like they're going to hit you and you're going to be down and dead instantly. And I think that's something people fail to recognize too.
Yeah, there were some people, including the final prosecution attorney's sort of second closing, because I'm going to get into closing arguments a little bit later, but in the second closing statements, the second prosecuting attorney basically said, well, he shouldn't have shot, he should have like gotten up and fought with his fists. A whole really weird rant about how he could have resolved this in like a less deadly manner, but that completely takes away from the fact that getting hit with a skateboard in the head can kill you or cause permanent damage, in which case you're also justified in using deadly force. The jump kick, for example, getting kicked in the head. As a doctor, please tell me, can getting kicked in the head kill you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Depending on how you're kicked and where you're kicked, it may not right away, but even indirectly, you get kicked in the face, you fall and you hit your head on a sidewalk. I mean, that's certainly something that would lead to your death.
There you go. I mean, a lot of people want to downplay the amount of violence and just how deadly the violence was, but you get hit for a few times, and like one of the reasons that Kyle appeared to have stumbled was because he was hit with a skateboard once. He didn't fall immediately, but he seemed to fall like 20 steps down the road, presumably because of being hit in the head. I mean, this was serious, and a lot of people don't want to see it that way. It's just a skateboard. I just kind of get kicked a little bit. And by the way, the guy who did the jump kick, that guy was black. So the one person Kyle didn't actually shoot with his gun was black. So maybe he's actually not racist at all. That could be part of it.
Yeah, go figure, right?
Yeah. So anyway, do you have anything else that you want to present directly from those articles, or you want me to get into the defense arguments and closing, or what?
Oh, no, go ahead, continue.
All right. So let's talk about the defense here. So like I said, I thought the prosecution's witnesses kind of blew up in their faces, and the prosecution had a really weak case. I think it's actually quite possible that the defense could have just rested at that point, not have put on a case at all, and said, did you guys hear what the prosecution just said? They said that Kyle didn't shoot until a guy pointed a gun at him. He didn't shoot until another guy tried to grab the gun from him. He was hit in the head with a skateboard. He got kicked in the face. This is self-defense. End of story. And that honestly could have been it. That could have gotten him off. But I think they really did have some other really valuable witnesses too. So I want to talk about that. And also, the defense put Kyle on the stand to testify, which I think was really unnecessary and a very risky move, but they got away with it at least. But yeah, let's talk about that. So I think the one non-Kyle witness that the defense brought up was a photographer. I forget what his name actually was. I think some people online were referring to him as Photo Chad. And this guy, he seemed to be kind of somewhere on the autistic spectrum. I don't know whether this was confirmed, but a lot of people seem to be of that opinion online. And he spoke in a certain way that made you think, okay, yeah, I could probably see him being autistic in some way, or neurodivergent in some way. I don't know the proper terms here. But this guy, he was a photographer. He was out there taking pictures of the riots that night. And he seemed to be a very like McGinnis, the journalist. He seemed to be just kind of a neutral observer to everything. He got some very good photos of the action, and one part of his testimony was specifically about being called in by the prosecution to show some photos, and also being asked if he would testify in other trials, because there were many criminal trials stemming from the events of that night. So in this particular trial, he was called by the defense, but in other trials, he may have been called by the prosecution. And he seemed perfectly willing to support both, because he just seemed to want to present the evidence and let the evidence speak for himself. So he seemed to be like a very neutral witness. Like, there were some witnesses on both sides that seemed to be obviously biased in favor of the side they were on. And that's perfectly fine. But at the same time, one of the jobs of the jury is to determine the credibility of various witnesses. One of the last witnesses that the defense called was actually a very sort of politically charged guy. He really went after the prosecution. He spoke back. He had a lot of attitude in his answers. And perhaps he thought that would play well, but that kind of thing actually doesn't play well at all. You think, well, this guy's biased. Even if I'm predisposed to having the same point of view as him, just from the way he's talking, he doesn't seem to be giving straight answers. He seems to be trying to point us towards a specific conclusion. And people, regardless of what side they're on, they don't like being told how to think. They like being able to make their own conclusions, even if their own biases will sort of disfigure those conclusions in some way. So this guy, on the other hand, this photographer, he seemed to be a real straight shooter, perhaps because of whatever autism he may have had, and just seemed to be a really honest guy. And he talked about one event when he was called into the prosecutor's office, and the prosecutor was actually the one questioning him about this, which makes it really good, because it's not, you can't say that the defense set him up for this. The prosecution just walked into this of their own volition. So this photographer, he gets called into the prosecutor's office and gets asked about one of the pictures that he took. And he says, yeah, here's a picture that I took of that night. I remember taking this picture. The prosecutor asked him if he remembered who one of the people in that picture was. And he says, no, I don't remember who this person was. And the prosecutor says, oh, this guy is, Larry McBeal, or whatever you want to call this guy. So it's like, okay, well, so that guy was Larry McBeal. And then the prosecutor is like, turns over the picture, turns it back over again and says, this guy is Larry McBeal, right? It's like, well, I actually didn't know that at the time, but you'll testify to the fact that this guy is Larry McBeal. And it's like, I don't know. And the whole thing just seemed like, okay, it looks like you're just bullying an autistic guy on the witness stand. And the guy, he testifies like he felt really uncomfortable after that, and he went out and even hired his own attorney, because he felt so uncomfortable about the way the prosecution was trying to make him spin the evidence of his own photographs. And the prosecution just came off looking so sleazy in this moment. And the prosecutor who was questioning him, there were two prosecutors and two defense attorneys who did most of the witness testimony and the presentation of proof. The prosecutor who was up here got really, really pissed off at the witness here and started really badgering him, and just dug his hole even deeper. And perhaps he thought that because this guy may have been autistic, he could bully this guy into saying what he wanted. But it seemed to be the exact opposite. I think that because this guy was probably autistic in some way, he was really insistent upon sticking to his own version of the truth. He didn't get the message that this guy wanted him to change his answers, or that he could probably avoid the discomfort by changing his answers. So, man, that is my favorite witness in the whole trial. And if you're going to watch, I guess, any three witnesses in this whole trial, I recommend watching the two guys I mentioned from the prosecution, the journalist McGinnis, Gage Groskowitz, who got shot in the arm, and this guy, I forget his name, DeBron, I think was his name, DeBrun or DeBron, the photographer from the defense. Watch those three guys. And if you can watch those three guys and say with a straight face that Kyle still should have been guilty, then I don't know what to say. Maybe, you're just living in your own candy land, as one of the defense attorneys said at one point. But if you watch those three witnesses, you should not be surprised at all, no matter what your political leanings, that Kyle was found not guilty here. All right. And of course, the other thing I want to talk about is that Kyle was put on the stand here to testify. Now, I was watching the Rekieta Law stream of the trial, and Nick Rekieta is a lawyer who I've been watching for actually a very long time here. He covered Maddox versus Dix Masterson's case. He's covered a lot of interesting cases involving internet law and other high-profile cases, the Vic Mignogna voice actor lawsuit, for example, in the anime community. And he was putting on a stream of this trial with a bunch of other lawyers who I think did a fantastic job. They actually got tremendous view counts on YouTube. They had at some points of the trial over 100,000 viewers simultaneously watching, and that put them over any other competing news source, including PBS. He like blew those guys out of the water. But yeah, he put on a really, really good stream with a whole bunch of other lawyers, and every single other lawyer on that panel, at some point there were as many as 10 lawyers together in that stream, they were cringing when the defense called Kyle to testify, because of course you have your Fifth Amendment right not to testify against yourself. It's known as the right against self-incrimination. You have the right to remain silent. So Kyle could have just sat this one out, let the witnesses speak for themselves. I think there was plenty of testimony to let him off the hook here, but the defense wanted to put him on anyway. It was explained by the lead defense attorney after the trial was over that he actually did 2 mock trials, one with Kyle on the stand and one without Kyle on the stand. And based on the results of those mock trials, the results were actually quite convincing that Kyle did better on the stand than sitting it out. He also said that in Wisconsin specifically, it's actually fairly common practice to want to put your defendant on the stand in a criminal trial in the case of a self-defense claim. So maybe that's just how things are there locally, but I think many attorneys from outside the area were absolutely shocked, and if they were supporters of Kyle, terrified that Kyle would be testifying. But overall, I think Kyle avoided a lot of really potentially damaging statements. At one point, and this was another viral moment, he actually started crying in the middle of his trial. And people online were saying, he's just faking it. In my opinion, it was quite real. You know, I'm not that good of a judge of whether people are crying for real or not, but I believed it. You know, if you're 18 years old and you're facing life in prison and you're reliving the moments that you shot at 3 people or 4 people, that could be very well enough to make you cry. Later on, it was not testified, but it was mentioned by the defense attorney that Kyle had PTSD. And sometimes in criminal cases or even civil cases as well, even if you don't actually have emotional damage or PTSD, you want to send your client to a psychiatrist anyway, at least to have some sort of proof that there is actually mental or emotional damage to them, because otherwise it's a hard claim to actually believe. But if you actually have been sending someone to a psychiatrist, then maybe you can get that evidence in and it's more convincing. It comes up a lot in medical malpractice cases, actually, even if you don't actually believe that someone has these issues, you want to send them to a doctor anyway, because if you can even get one opinion from a medical professional saying that this person has some sort of damage to them, whether it's physical, mental, emotional, etc., you can use that at trial. So Kyle, he cries at that point. I don't think Kyle really said anything that noteworthy, to be honest. And that's probably something that came out in his favor. But I personally think that was an unnecessary risk, but him being on the stands, he avoided the worst case scenario, at least, because there were some videos out there, for example, of him getting into fights before, not related to this incident at all. And in criminal law, you're not allowed to introduce evidence of a defendant's character. Like, this guy is the kind of guy who goes out and gets into fights. You're not allowed to do that unless the defense introduces evidence of his good character first. So if he said the wrong thing, if he said something along the lines of, well, I'm not the kind of guy who gets into fights, if he even implied that strongly enough, then the prosecution would be like, well, on this date, so-and-so, you got into a fight at your school, didn't you? And they could bring in statements like that. There was one statement that I think the prosecution wanted to bring up and tried to bring up at trial, actually, was a statement that he made in like a CVS parking lot when he saw someone shoplifting. He said something along the lines of, man, I wish I had my gun with me so I could shoot that person down right now. Something to that effect. And of course, that's a pretty bad statement to have in a trial if you start talking about someone's character. So thankfully, Kyle didn't say anything that would allow that in, but the prosecution attorney tried to introduce that statement anyway, and the judge got pissed. He sent the jury out of the room and he yelled at the prosecution attorney for trying to introduce that, even though earlier in a pretrial motion, he said that statement would not be allowed unless new grounds came up to allow it. And that very day, the judge reaffirmed that there had been no new grounds up until that point to introduce that kind of statement about being in the CVS parking lot and thinking about shooting shoplifters. But the prosecution tried to bring that up. They got smacked down. And once again, the prosecution comes off looking like real sleazebags here because the jury didn't hear that full statement. But when the prosecution says something like that, and the judge cuts him off and says, yo, be quiet right now. Jury, please leave the room. The jury has to infer that the judge is going to yell at that prosecuting attorney, just as he actually did. All right. There were some other issues too. So that was actually one of the grounds for a potential mistrial, the fact that they tried to introduce that kind of evidence, even though they weren't allowed to. Other issues, let's see. So talking about the Fifth Amendment, once again, that's an extremely important amendment when it comes to trial, the right to remain silent. There was at one point when the prosecuting attorney was questioning Kyle, that he started to make reference to the fact that Kyle gave an interview with some publication at a certain time. And the prosecuting attorney was said something to the effect of, well, that was the first interview you gave with everyone. You didn't say anything until that point, did you? And the defense thankfully objected. And once again, jury was sent out, judge yells at the prosecutor, because you're not allowed to draw any inference against the defendant based on the fact that they remain silent. That's pretty standard law. They have the right to remain silent. You can't assume they are more guilty because they didn't speak to journalists until the trial, right? So the prosecuting attorney got bitched out there too, and once again comes off looking extremely sleazy, and that would have been grounds for a mistrial as well. So the defense actually made that motion towards the end, but the judge decided, I'm going to see how this plays out with the jury first before ruling on any of these motions. So there was no mistrial declared. The judge seemed to really want the jury to be the one to make this call because it was a high-profile case, and he didn't want to seem like he was being the one making all the calls, taking the decision away from the people. It seemed like the best way for people to accept the verdict in this trial would be for that verdict to come from the jury, not to take the power away from the jury and make the decision himself, especially after being accused of bias. In fact, there were some points during the trial actually where the judge would actually comment on how he read media criticism of him. And yeah, you don't want to really get into that because that just means you seem even more biased because you know what people are saying about you and now you're reacting based on that. You want to actually ignore that entirely. But in any case, Kyle survived his own examination without saying anything too damning about himself, and the prosecution couldn't take advantage of that and in fact made several key missteps that got the judge yelling at him. And yeah, cross-examination when you have the defendant on the stand can be a disaster, but that was avoided here. All right. The prosecution did some other pretty shady things throughout the trial, and it's really unclear what the defendant knew about or was willing to object about. The defense really didn't object all that much throughout the trial. Like I said, the defense here, they played it very safe with what they were legally able to get away with. The defense, they were really pushing the boundaries. And because of that, the judge ruled a lot against the prosecution and in favor of the defense. And because of that, it seemed like to many people, the judge was really favoring the defendants. Although I don't think that was necessarily the case. I think it was just a matter of the prosecution being really sleazy and the defense being almost kind of lazy by not objecting as much as they really should to things that they could have objected to. All right. There are a few other sleazy things like Jump Kick Man. The prosecution kind of implied that that the identity of Jump Kick Man was unknown. It came out later that they actually knew who he was. And maybe the defense actually knew about this too. I don't know, but that also seems kind of sleazy. There were some trials for people who testified. Like one of the people that the prosecution called was Kyle's friend who bought the gun for him. And the prosecution asked him directly during their examination, well, we didn't offer you a plea deal on your charges, did we? And the guy said, no, you didn't offer me a deal. But then the defense comes up and asks the question, well, you weren't officially offered a plea deal, were you? And he says, no, I wasn't. But the defense says, you're hoping for a plea deal based on your testimony today. And the guy says, well, yeah, I am. So that comes off as kind of sleazy too, depending on how good the testimony is. This guy might get a plea deal if he says the right things. It seems like for some of the other witnesses also, the prosecution sort of delayed some of those trials intentionally so that they could see how the testimony from this trial went. And perhaps based on how this trial went, they would change their strategy going forward regarding those defendants. So the whole thing just came off as really sleazy by the prosecution there. Like, I don't want to call it witness tampering exactly, but the prosecution does this all the time, always has the power to do this in many different cases, which is one of the reasons why I'm kind of default on the side of the defense. Tie goes to the defendant, in my opinion. That's my personal bias, but it's because the prosecution has so much power in these cases, and they often use it kind of sleazily. It's almost normalized when you're a prosecutor. You know it's sleazy, but you also know you can get away with it, so you do it anyway. All right. And like I said, there was the photographer, there was sleazy towards the photographer. So the prosecution comes off looking really bad here. All right. Then, of course, there's a long jury deliberation. It took, I believe, 4 full days, almost like a full week, because they had the Monday off, right? Was it a national holiday?
This past Monday? Not that I'm aware. Maybe that Tuesday was Veterans Day? Or maybe
That might have been it. Yes. I actually recall that. So they had, I guess, the long weekend because of Veterans Day. And one of the witnesses, actually, another reason why the judge was accused of being biased was at some point, like right after Veterans Day, or maybe it was on Veterans Day, he asks around the courtroom, he's like, well, is anyone here a veteran? And actually, one of the witnesses was a veteran. And he's like, well, thank you for your service, sir, or something to that effect. And that was a defense witness, I suppose. And people are like, oh my God, he's bringing up the fact that this guy is a veteran and praising this witness for the defense. How biased can this judge possibly be? And that was just a coincidence. Perhaps the judge shouldn't have done that because there was the risk of that happening, but that's just an honest mistake. I definitely would not attribute that to bias, but when you're grasping for straws because you have a political agenda, this is what you say, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so there's the jury deliberation. It takes 4 days, but not every single charge takes 4 days to conclude. We actually, we have some of the jury sheets now. 2 of the charges were solved on the first day. There was the charge against the skateboard guy, and there was the charge against, let's see, skateboard guy and the jump kick guy. Those were both found not guilty right away. And I suppose the reason for that is those people both made direct contact with Kyle, so it's very easy to think of that as a self-defense case. Then the next day, the charge against, Groskowitz, the guy who was shot in the arm, that was also dismissed because, once again, there was very clear testimony that Groskowitz pointed the gun at him, and Kyle didn't shoot until the gun was pointed at him. So, yep, once again, self-defense there. And then the 2 charges that took a little bit longer were actually the initial charge against Rosenbaum, the guy who threw the gun at him and was the first person shot. He grabbed for the gun, said, fuck you, grabbed for the gun, and Kyle Rittenhouse shot at him 4 times. So that was the first guy. And perhaps in that case, the prosecution tried a really weird strategy towards the end where they kind of changed their strategy mid-trial. Some of the arguments they made, they completely ditched that. And towards the end, they're like, well, provocation. This is actually a case of provocation. And the defense called them out on that in the closing arguments. In the closing arguments, the defense attorney points out, you didn't hear about anything about provocation until just now. The defense clearly knows that they've lost, and they're trying to present an all-new theory before you because perhaps this is the only straw that they have for you to grasp at. So there was this whole provocation theory that the prosecution presented towards the very end, and that kind of made things murky. So I think that's why that took a little bit longer. And then there was also, at the very end, the reckless endangerment charge, because that's a weird one as well. I think in this case, the jury instructions were unclear. So like I said, the role of the judge and the jury, the judge's role is to resolve issues of law. The jury's role is to resolve issues of fact. So something like the gun charge. The gun charge, that was largely a matter of law. You have to read the statute and determine whether a 17-year-old in possession of a long enough gun is allowed to carry the gun. To look at that as an issue of fact may be, how long was the gun? You know, because that's not, because you have to actually look at the gun, measure the gun, things like that, believe someone's testimony as to how long the gun was, perhaps. That's an issue of fact for the jury. The jury answers questions like, who shot first? Was someone in legitimate danger? These are issues of fact. And the judge has to take those factual determinations from the jury and figure out how that fits into the law. So the jury determines that this is a long enough gun. The jury determines that he does not have a hunting license. The jury determines that he's 17 years old. Based on these determined facts, how does that fit into the law? Does the law say he's guilty or not? And in the case of the gun, he was not guilty. So the factual issues to be determined by the jury here are based on jury instructions provided by the judge. And some of the jury instructions were really unclear with regards to the reckless endangerment charge. So for example, the judge had to instruct them on what role self-defense plays regarding reckless endangerment. And there was this really weird instruction about how self-defense doesn't necessarily apply in the case of reckless endangerment. You can have self-defense against one person, but not have self-defense against someone sitting around in the background at the same time. So you can have self-defense against Gage Groskowitz shooting at you, but shooting back at him, it might not be appropriate self-defense against someone in the background who's not really a threat. It was a really weird and complicated instruction. And that's why I think that took a long time. That was probably the last issue that the jury really struggled with. But at the end of the day, they came back not guilty on that one too. I think better jury instructions should have been given out, but ultimately they came to the right conclusion. One more thing I want to say, speaking of the closing arguments, I think that another thing that I recommend strongly watching is the defense's closing arguments. They were a thing of beauty. Like I said, I think the defense was largely really lazy throughout the trial when it came to objections and some of the questions they could have asked but didn't. But on closing arguments, they totally redeemed themselves. The closing argument by the lead defense attorney, who I thought was probably the worst attorney at the trial up to that point, was brilliant. And he was a more forceful type of attorney, but I think it really worked under those circumstances because they had such a strong case, and you could hear the disgust in his voice when he was talking about the charges that the prosecution brought, even though they really had no case. So watch that. I would recommend watching, if you're going to watch anything, watch those three witnesses. The journalist, McGinnis, the guy who got shot in the arm, Gage Groskowitz, the photographer, I think his name was DeBrun, and the closing arguments by the defense, because he just knocked it out of the park with that. All right, so that's the trial. You got anything else you want to talk about? Like, we talked a good bit about media coverage until this point, but I think I've said everything that I want to say at that point. But yeah, you got anything else you want to talk about?
I mean, I think pretty much I said basically everything that had been going on. I mean, very strong bias. I'm actually a little bit surprised that the aftermath hasn't been as extreme as I thought it would be. I expect to be hearing much more about like riots breaking out on the streets. I expected to hear a lot more, like, but I haven't. And I think maybe that's a testament to the fact that this really was such an open and shut case, that while there was going to be some dissent, while there was going to be some people who are going to be upset about it, that maybe the fact that it wasn't nearly to the level that I thought it would be shows that, hopefully, regardless of political leaning, a lot of people recognized that this was not what it was originally portrayed to be.
Yeah, I agree with that. You had clips of this trial coming out, being viral across the internet, of the defense, the prosecution shooting themselves in the foot, and the defense getting some good questions in on cross-examination. People kind of expected this to happen. And yeah, there are people who are going to complain and riot no matter what. But I think the average person, at least, who watched these clips or read relatively unbiased news sources, knew how this was going to turn out, and they were able to accept it. So the threat of massive riots in the street were kind of quashed. Also in Kenosha, they did send out like 500 National Guard troops, so that probably helped as well. Oh, another thing that I want to point out, MSNBC, they got caught sending one of their journalists sort of tail the jury. You heard about that? They were
I
like,
did hear about that.
yeah, they were following the jury bus. That looks so bad. So once again, media bias, and they even tried to cover for it. They're like, yeah, we don't really know this guy. He's a freelancer or whatever. But yeah, how can you watch something like that and still trust the media? I have no idea. And to be clear, I have my own political biases for sure, but I think it's really important to call out bias in media, no matter whether it comes from the left or the right. I used to be a big fan of The Daily Show back when Jon Stewart did it, because he did a great job of calling out right-wing media. And, nowadays, I think it's really important to call out left-wing media because they have much more of an influence in these kinds of cases. But I enjoy calling out both sides. I have no political reason not to. I mean, what's your political leaning here? Do you lean particularly right or left or center or what?
Well, I think both of us identify as libertarian. I think I think between the two of us, I lean slightly more towards the left, you lean slightly more towards the right. But I'm certainly not at a point where, liberals would consider me a liberal. I'm certainly not at a point where conservatives would consider me a conservative, which is why I'm able to look at this case and say, you know what, like, forget what I think about Trump, Proud Boys, Bugaloo, whatever, or Blue Lives Matter. This guy clearly didn't do anything wrong, and I was able to conclude that simply because of all this. My own inherent reaction anytime I see anything like this in the news is to be like, all right, calm down. Let me actually read the story and see what happened before I try to form a conclusion, which I think what people should be, and unfortunately they don't. But to answer your question, that's sort of where I stand, politically, on this whole issue.
Yeah, I definitely identify as a libertarian, and depending on what the general political consensus is at the time, I could be considered more right wing or left wing. I think during the Bush years, I definitely felt like I was more left wing, and during the whole war on terror, Patriot Act, all that garbage. And then in modern times, when you have leftist politics, where they're basically getting away scot-free with burning down cities, I think that's pretty fucking stupid. So you might consider me more right-wing at this point in time. But in general, my politics, I don't think they've really changed since I was in high school. I'm a libertarian. I think I've gotten slightly more moderate over time, if anything. But yeah, libertarians are often associated with gun rights. And in a philosophical sense, or a legal sense, perhaps, yes, we have a Second Amendment. I believe it says that you do have the general right to bear arms, and that Kyle was fully within his legal rights. But at the same time, I don't think it was a good idea for him to go down there with a gun like that. And I think he also, perhaps, if he could do it all over again, he would have just stayed home. But yeah, this whole mess, I think, could have been avoided and probably should have been avoided. I think the best thing really would have been for the police to also not be so political, or at least taking political orders to stand down and let the rioters riot. They should prosecute Antifa or BLM or all these people who are very obviously committing crimes on camera. And, they went really hard after the January 6th protesters, as I believe they should, or at least the ones who did break into the Capitol. I believe there were some people who were just standing outside and they were put on no-fly lists. And I think that's absolutely bullshit. But the people who did commit crimes, yeah, go ahead and prosecute them. But at the same time, don't make it political. If you see people, burning down buildings and stealing stuff from Targets and AutoZones in Kenosha, prosecute them too. It shouldn't be, prosecution should not be politicized. I think that's extremely important. And many people on the left seem to think that it's okay to politicize it because in this political climate, they can get away with it. But what's going to happen 10 years down the line if the pendulum swings back to the right? You can't base your justice system on political persecution. And I think this is a very clear case of that. You're not going to see a more obvious case of self-defense probably ever, whether it's high profile or not. If this were not a case with national media attention, I do not think it would have been brought to trial. The district attorney wasn't the attorney handling this case. He put it off on some of his minions in the prosecutor's office because he knew it was going to be a loser. I'm sure he would have been happy to accept the victory and take credit for it if they won. But at the same time, because they lost, he can kind of distance himself from it and perhaps not receive as much political fallout. But I think there's no doubt in my mind that this was a political-based prosecution. And there were so many cameras out there. This is one of the major differences between this kind of case and cases in the past. we could see the evidence very clearly. And perhaps if there weren't cameras everywhere and photographers everywhere, the case may have potentially turned out differently if it was based simply on witness testimony without any physical evidence to back it up. But with all the evidence here, I don't think you're ever going to see a more clear case of justified self-defense than this case here. And it's a shame that it was even brought in the first place. And Kyle, I think he made a mistake, and there were some really random, weird attacks on him at the trial. His TikTok account, did you see that? What that was called? His TikTok account name was 4 Doors More Whores, and the prosecution brought that up at trial just to kind of embarrass him. I mean, I think Kyle was just a regular stupid kid, and he didn't intend to kill anyone when he went there, but he was certainly prepared to if it came to that. And he was legally justified in doing so, but it would have been better for him to not go out there in the first place. And I certainly don't recommend that anyone participate in these kinds of violent riots, whether they're pro or against them or just neutral bystanders. Just stay home. The police should do their job. The prosecutors should do their job, and this shit should not happen. Well, that's my rant. Any thoughts?
No, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, somebody else said something similar as well that I saw, and it's like, you know what? The reality is, like, teenagers do dumb shit all the time at the age of 17. I mean, a lot of that dumb shit just happens and people forget about it and thankfully never comes back to haunt them. I mean, this is one unfortunate case where, this guy did something, perhaps with good intentions, but nonetheless not properly thought through. And unfortunately, brought him into a spotlight, and, he endured a lot of hardship for it. Do I think he necessarily did anything wrong? No, but I certainly think he was careless. I certainly do think he didn't necessarily think it through all the way and acted more on passion. Again, something most teenagers would do. So, I mean, it seems like in the future he'll be more cautious, and I certainly think he'd be staying out of the spotlight for a very long time.
Yeah, and I think now my left-wing side is coming out here, but don't put your life on the line to protect some rich guy's car lot, like his used car store. I mean, those were some of the more interesting witnesses as well. We didn't get into it today, but there were like some Indian immigrants who owned this car lot, and I think the owners, the mother and the father, they don't really speak English well, so they didn't testify. So instead they got the 2 sons to testify. And you got the sense they were just completely lying through their teeth about so many different things. Like, they kind of denied ever asking for help, even though there was some pretty clear evidence that they were the ones who asked for help and got all the people with guns to come down and to help protect their lot. It's quite possible that they actually committed insurance fraud by lying about the amount of damage that was done. It was either lying or absolute gross incompetence. And yeah, some really, really shady guys on stand there. But yeah, I wouldn't risk my life to protect some rich guy's car lot only for him to come out on the stand and lie about my involvement. Don't involve yourself with stuff like that. I mean, everyone should protect themselves and do whatever they think is necessary. And yeah, political participation is important, but I think it should be done peacefully, and that's what the police are for. If they see a peaceful protest, and it's actually a peaceful protest, not what CNN or MSNBC wants to pretend is a peaceful protest, but if there's actually a peaceful protest, people should absolutely participate in that, and the police should stand back. But when people start to engage in violence, regardless of what side they're on, the police should get involved and do what's necessary to keep the peace.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that makes perfect sense.
Anyway, that's basically all I want to say about this. And as always, if you have any questions, please leave a comment, and I'm happy to get back to them and respond if I can. As always, I'm a lawyer based in Japan. I'll try to help you with your legal issues, or at least make my comments. Nothing that I say is legal advice. And we have Allopathosaurus here, a medical doctor. Our next topic, I hope, is going to be about the anime monster, because he's a doctor and he can give some commentary on various medical scenes from this anime. And we have lots of other stuff planned too. If you have any topics you want to suggest, please let us know, legal or medical topics, and we might make a show about it. All right. So you good, Allopathosaurus?
I am good.
All right, then thanks for watching, and see everyone next time.